Danny, Claire and I are involved in peer support for people with long COVID, who've a lot of whom have had these symptoms going on for months and months and months. And they very much don't want to get COVID again, but they are very nervous about vaccines because there's a fear that a vaccine might just kind of kick off their immune system again. You've talked about COVID throwing a hand grenade into the immune system, and they're worried that the vaccine just is going to set off that process again and put them back to square one. Could you talk about that and maybe reassure them?
Yeah. So I think, okay, the first thing to say is that, all of this is uncertain and we are in uncharted territory with new symptoms of a new infection. But when I try and think about where long COVID symptoms could come from, I think of it very much as being the consequences of a full-blown viral infection with all the different bits and all the different genes that a virus has. And we know of lots of nasty and disruptive things that SARS-CoV-2 virus can do to you. And so then you say, so could that be reiterated or exacerbated in some way by getting a vaccine? And my answer would be, I would really, really doubt it. So if I was in the shoes of anybody with long COVID, my logic would be, last time I met this virus, it was absolutely devastating to me and had a terrible effect on me and on my life and on my family. And people do get reinfected, and they can get reinfected. And so my best insurance policy against that is to have a really high level of anti-spike neutralizing antibodies on board, elicited by the vaccine. So how do I know that the vaccine couldn't do me any harm or do the same thing? Again, my best answer to that would be that the vaccine doesn't reiterate the features of the virus and all the kind of perturbations that it does to the immune system. Each of the vaccines we're talking about, and in this country at the moment, the main ones we're talking about are the Pfizer mRNA vaccine and the AstraZeneca Oxford adenovirus vaccine. And they're both variations on the theme of taking the sequence of the main antigen, the spike antigen, and dropping it into a cassette where it can stimulate your T cells to get activated against spike and your antibodies to get activated against spike and just give you that protection. So it's really, really hard to see how that could be anything other than advantageous.
Do you think there's any possibility that a vaccine might even help people with long COVID? Some people feel as if the virus is persisting, and there's some evidence from some work on viral persistence in the gut. So if you were still having symptoms because of viral persistence, then could the vaccine actually help that? Could it kind of finally knock it on the head?
And I think that's a really brilliant point and a really brilliant question. So, perhaps I should have said more in my answer about mechanisms. That there have been so many confounders in the discussion of COVID-19 and how this virus works. And I would never have guessed that a coronavirus could persist in your body. And yet, as you say, there's really good hard evidence out there in some kind of subset of people of long-term SARS-CoV-2 persisting in the gut. And also a lot of people out there in the long COVID community who have been antibody tested and have found that they haven't retained high levels of antibodies, or some of them never made high levels of antibodies. And again, there are many possible explanations for that. But for my taste, one of the strange things about this virus has been how subversive it is and how good it is at evading immunity and turning on dysfunctional immunity. So again, by having a vaccine that really gives you a proper bona fide full-blown immune response to the spike, I completely agree with you. It needs to be looked at, but it could be a way of getting a high level of neutralizing antibodies on board, a high level of T cells that really could wipe out that reservoir of virus.
Something people often ask is, if I've already had COVID, I've already been exposed to SARS-CoV-2, why do I need a vaccine then? Because surely if I've had the virus, isn't natural infection going to give me more immunity than the vaccine would?
Yeah, and a good question. So many, I could give a whole seminar on this, many answers I could give. The first thing to say is that one of the tricks that coronaviruses play on us is, as I said, that they evade immunity and they subvert immunity. And one of my favorite papers of the last year has been a paper out of Amsterdam where they looked at 35 years of serum samples from a blood bank cohort and showed that the people got the same 4 common cold coronaviruses year after year after year in perpetuity, despite having generated an antibody response each year. So the first thing to say is that, coronaviruses are ghastly. The common cold viruses crossed over very much like this one has as a zoonosis from the animal population more than 1,000 years ago, and has never left us in peace since. So if you needed no other argument for why you should have the vaccine, for me, that would be it. We don't want another 1,000 years of this. We want some peace, and we can't afford to pay that price. And so the reasoning behind that, obviously, as I said, is that although immunologists all over the world are measuring immune responses as hard as we can go and publishing on the T-cell responses and their antibody responses and the durability of them, the answer seems to be over and over again that the level of of response you can get, and hopefully the durability of immune response you can get out of a vaccine, is so much better than what you can get out of natural immunity to the initial infection. Mm-hmm. So when you put that together with the fact that some people's responses, just because people are variable, seem to be weak or waning or disappearing or never there, it's just too much of a chance to take. If there's a vaccine out there that can really, give you that security, so you can, go to the shops again, or go to work together again, or sit on a train together without fearing for your life, why on earth would you not do that?
Pfizer and I think Moderna are messenger
Yeah,
RNA vaccines. Yeah. So people get a bit worried. They see RNA and it's like DNA. So can you reassure people that mRNA entering your cells isn't going to affect your DNA?
Yeah, so I can completely and utterly. So, I think all the new generation vaccines that have come to the fore this year are really exciting and really effective, and, have been far better than any of us ever dreamt in terms of their ability to induce big immune responses and their effectiveness at blocking viral infections. So I've been really, really impressed by them. And I think some people have been worried by them because, I think research was kind of, damned if we do and damned if we don't. On the one hand, it was, will they be produced really, really fast because we really need them? Mm. And on the other hand, if they've been produced really, really fast, they must be no good. And they must be produced too fast and they must be unsafe. And all I can say is, that's really not the case. These are really safe vaccines because although they've been produced from start to finish in 10 months, each of the ones we're talking about, and I include the mRNA vaccines there and the viral vaccines and all the others, are based on, in each case, 10 to 15 years of background research and hard graft to be kind of ready for battle when the day came. So they weren't produced in 10 months. The sequences were dropped in 10 months, but all of the rest of the stuff had been tried and tested for more than 10 years. And so we know a ton of stuff, for example, about the mRNA vaccines, that they're very clever. They go into your muscle as a little kind of encapsulated ball of mRNA, and they briefly get turned into spike protein to turn on your immune response. And it's kind of double whammy because at the same time as the RNA goes in to turn on manufacture of spikes, so you become kind of factory for antigen in the short term, the RNA itself is a trigger for innate immunity to tell your immune system to kind of ramp up production and become more activated. So if you measure the immune responses, they just work really, really well, and then they get extinguished and chucked out, and they're not in your body. There's no mechanism, there's no enzyme that can turn them from RNA into your DNA. There's no clever way of doing that. So that isn't done and can't be done. They're simply extinguished once they've done their job, and you then have an immune memory to spike to go on and make a ton of antibodies and T cells, which really last you longer and better than natural infection.
So you would need there would need to be some other clever bit of biological engineering put in there to get RNA into your DNA to get any.
Yeah, so evolution hasn't invented a way of doing that. So it's a temporary hit into your muscle cells to become a sort of short-term factory for antigen, turn on a load of antibody, and then leave. So it won't change, your body, a human body at all. That can't be done.
Can these vaccines affect your fertility? There was a concern that I heard about an amino acid sequence, which was similar to a protein which is involved in placental, something to do with the placenta anyway. And there was a worry that then if you had the antibodies and you got pregnant, then something would attack the placenta.
Yeah, no, so I heard that as well. It's been put to me a few times, and I've worked so hard to try and follow the logic of what was being said and which cross-reactive autoimmunity was being implicated and whether anybody had ever shown a glimmer of evidence for it. And, with the best will in the world and, 4 decades of immunology behind me, I couldn't work out what the logic was for that concern because I've never seen any data for it and I can't see any kind of sequence basis for it. So all I can say is, if there is some logic to it, it really defeats me. So it wouldn't stop me getting a vaccine for myself or anybody in my family.
And we do have discussions about allergies quite a lot. This is something that we're finding coming up in long COVID. Some people are becoming allergic to things that they never were allergic to before. Mm. So people are a bit worried about with the Pfizer vaccine, there is an alert about allergies and anaphylaxis, and they're advising that if you have a history of that you should avoid it. Is there such an alert for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine?
Yeah, so there's actually quite a lot to deconstruct in that question, without sort of trivializing anybody's concerns. I think we're talking about different things where the word allergy comes up in both contexts. So one is that it's intriguing to me, and it's one of the things that has to be part of the research agenda for the next little while. Is there seems to be a very valid entry on the list of symptoms, which is lots of people, manifesting strange new allergic reactions as a consequence of their long COVID. And I'm desperate to find out more about that and understand more about that. And there's lots of immunology one could apply to that because, when I talk about, hand grenades in the immune system and perturbed immune subsets, it seems to bear on that because obviously, we all know that there are people out there who from childhood are much more allergic than others. The people who are sort of on that, what's called the atopic spectrum, who have asthma or eczema or hay fever or combinations of them or food allergies or peanut allergies and things. And that's to do with their immune programming and immune subset polarization. So to take people who've never previously had that, who suddenly in adult life get sort of switched into a more of an allergic program, I think is really, up for investigation and, can be handled, can be dealt with if we can only understand it better. So that's one context to talk about, allergy and COVID and long COVID. And then in my mind, there's a sort of separate discussion, which is that God knows how many million doses of the Pfizer vaccine have been given out in the world so far. There've been a tiny number of people who've had anaphylactic responses, which were transient and passed and were treated very, very, very happily, to a component of the sort of the carrier that the mRNA sits in, which is really exotic and rare and a special feature of their anaphylactic repertoire, and almost by definition is a kind of 1 in a million event. So so I'm not saying that's trivial, because if you're that 1 in a million and you're suffering the anaphylactic response and have to kind of whip out your EpiPen, it's a really big deal. But it's not something you can kind of induce or create, or it's you either are that anaphylactic person or you're not.
Okay.
Does that clarify? So different
Yeah.
kind of discussions of allergy.
Right. Okay. So they're different parts of the kind of allergy spectrum.
So while I accept that it looks to me like those kind of new allergic manifestations might be common within the long COVID list, but that doesn't suggest to me that a vaccine would exacerbate those in any way whatsoever. On the contrary, it might improve them.
There's 2 vaccines that have been approved in the UK at the moment: the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer.
Yeah.
Given that we probably won't have a choice anyway, but if we had a choice, if you have long COVID and you had a choice of those vaccines, is there any that would be preferable to the other?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot, and I've got almost nothing intelligent to say about it. Partly because I do think we'll take what we're given, and I think it's crazy times, isn't it? Because we thought we wouldn't have any vaccines to choose from, and we didn't have, and now we've got almost a sort of globally an embarrassment of riches, and suddenly we've all become a bit snooty about it, and suddenly there's kind of vaccine snobbery creeping in. It's a bit like whether your neighbours drive a Tesla or a Honda, and which kind of household you want to be. Are you going to be a Pfizer household or an AstraZeneca household? I don't know which one's thought to be better, but I think it would be a really kind of considering that I promise you I've eyeballed all the data on all of them enormously, and I think they're all simply stupendous and amazing. So it would be a really bad direction of travel if we all became really snooty about it and said, well, I'm holding out for whichever the Ocado vaccine, because they're all amazing, and I, except in kind of very rare kind of clinical contraindications where I think the specifications of the AstraZeneca vaccine say not during pregnancy or breastfeeding, because of the usual kind of just sort of safety caveats about giving live viruses to pregnant or breastfeeding mothers. Apart from the usual specifications in the vaccines themselves, nothing would lead me to favor one over the other. I just grab anything I was given.
If we don't eradicate COVID, do you think there will come a time when, just like everybody in the world has had a common cold, everybody, will we get to a point where everybody will have had COVID? So you either get the vaccine or you get COVID. Give it a couple of years and it's going to be one or the other.
Well, I think that's kind of true, isn't it? And yet, the question is, particularly in the context of a long COVID discussion, will we ever be living at peace with it? And I think we probably won't. So the way I see it is, it's like kind of, fighting the big war and then settling down for years of kind of border skirmishes afterwards. You don't really want to be in that situation, because there's quite a big kind of resource cost to a kind of rumbling border skirmish that carries on for years or decades or centuries. And so I feel like at the moment, needs must, and we've had a debacle of a year, and we're facing a bit of a debacle for 2021. And anything goes just to get rid of it and get beyond this and move on and get people vaccinated. So that's why I keep saying, let's just get the vaccines out there, grab any vaccine you can and run with it and generate some antibodies. And I feel that very, very passionately. And there's certain decisions that one takes in the heat of battle just to kind of get on with it and do it. And I do think, when I think about all the events of 2020, I don't know how the kind of history textbooks in years to come will judge us, and also will judge, decisions that medics took, decisions that policymakers took, decisions that some countries took compared to other countries. Once we have the hindsight to see how it all panned out, because if it turns out that we're making choices that mean that it'll be kind of percolating in humanity for decades to come, and there may be long COVID, and there may be a certain tolerated level of people going to ITU, and there may be a tolerated level of people dying, like we have flu deaths every winter, I kind of feel like that wouldn't be a good thing, and that wouldn't be a job well done. And as time moves along, I think we will move into things like choices of the kind of vaccines you need to really wipe it out, so-called sterilizing vaccines. That means that nobody would have it down their lungs, therefore nobody could cough over the next person and start the next wave. And I think we've got to be quite tough on ourselves and aim for that quite fast, because the price is just too high.
One of the things that's characteristic, as you know, Danny, of long COVID is the fluctuating symptoms, the relapsing and remitting nature. A, what is that about? But B, in the context of vaccines, if someone is going through a relapse and feeling, and I don't know exactly how you define how bad they would be, but is there a certain point in time when they should not have the vaccine yet? You know, at what point should you, say you've been invited to have one and then you suddenly feel dreadful because of a relapse, what do you do?
You know, I think it's a really good question. So let's to rewind to the beginning. So you know, clearly neither I nor anybody else has a clue at the moment what the relapsing and remitting nature of long COVID means. But again, you know, it just seems really important to me to research it, because to me it seems very reminiscent of things that are just familiar to me. So I've spent you know, quite a few decades working on the immunology of multiple sclerosis, and I'm not saying for a moment that long COVID is the same as or has, you know, shared pathways with multiple sclerosis, and yet, you know, one of the things that people know about that disease is its relapsing and remitting time course. We can draw these beautiful graphs of the cycles going up and down, and you know, lucky people have 1 relapse per year, and unlucky people have 10 relapses per year, and they have lots of triggers that they describe that set them off. And the kind of pathways that are described are, well, mainly twofold. One is the way that stress, and by stress I'm using it both in the kind of scientific way and in the lay way, in a way simultaneously, you know, common stresses in your life, whether they're kind of you know, physical or emotional, can feed into biochemical pathways that can certainly trigger different parts of your immune response in a kind of inflammatory sense, and send you down an immune direction that you hadn't previously been going in, and exacerbate things. So a lot of discussion about that in the context of long COVID at the moment. And another one that also comes from the world of MS, which is just the idea that when we talk about white blood cells and their immune subsets, there are many of them, and immunologists love defining thousands of them. But if you're going to simplify it, you can see it as almost a sort of battle between the inflammatory cells doing quite aggressive things, and the kind of regulatory cells doing quite calming things and regulating them and calming them down. So in that context, it's not very hard to see how fluctuating levels of the regulators and the inflammers could get you into a relapsing and remitting mode. So for my taste, those are the kind of directions of travel for researchers, which are really doable, and I'm really keen to do, and I think lots of other people are as well. So that hasn't helped to answer your question about would I turn up for my vaccination appointment if I was in a sort of terrible flare-up and feeling really rubbish. You could say in sort of the simplest possible terms, if some people feel a bit rough after the vaccination anyway, and there is a sort of background level of people who get a bit of fever, fatigue, sore arm, whatever, the very mild adverse events, maybe you wouldn't want to kind of put yourself through that if you were feeling bad before you started. If you ask me more than that, I can't think of a kind of profound immunological reason why you'd be putting yourself in greater danger or anything. So I haven't got a sort of high-flown medical answer for why it would be a bad idea, except that, people who are feeling rubbish anyway perhaps aren't the best ones to kind of go and queue outside a vaccination tent. It might be better doing it another day. I don't know.
You mentioned there actually some of the kind of side effects that can happen after a vaccine. Is that something that is to be expected, even people who haven't had COVID at all, never mind long COVID?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important to talk about. Yeah. Because people always talk about these reports that go to the vaccine regulators, whether it's the FDA in America or the MHRA here, and they see large numbers for the adverse events, where if there've been 40,000 people in the trial, 3,600 or so have reported adverse events, and that seems like a very large number. And the answer is that the bar is set very low for going into your app and reporting your adverse events. So it really is somebody who had a bit of a headache that night, or somebody whose arm felt a bit tender that night. And it's really common low-level things. And the number of serious adverse events, is almost zero. It's terribly, terribly rare. So people shouldn't be kind of put off by the kind of jargon of adverse events. It doesn't mean what you think it means, or what some people think it means.
And if you do feel rough having had the vaccine, then hopefully it might pass in a couple of days, or does it mean that it has completely reawoken?
Well, one of the kind of cliches, I don't know if it's sort of medically proven or not, is people say you should almost count yourself lucky if you're one of the people with a sore arm or a bit of a fever, because that says that your immune system has really kicked into action, got turned on. That's a sign that something's working. And intuitively, that's kind of correct. But I've never seen any hard data to prove that people who had an adverse event respond better than people who didn't.
Are you aware that there's any follow-up research going on into people with long COVID who've had the vaccine? Is that something that we should be calling for? Is it already happening?
It's definitely something that should be called for. I've not seen anything explicit about it so far, but it's really something that's needed. Everything we're doing at the moment is in uncharted territory, and it's kind of work in progress, and we need the data. So I'm constantly having questions fired at me, like does it make a difference if you've had long COVID? Would you respond to the vaccine differently if you've been previously infected versus not infected? No answers out there, but if we don't start collecting the data, we'll never know.
Should people with long COVID be on the priority list to be vaccinated? Because I guess it turned out, we didn't know it at the time, that we turned out to be more vulnerable to getting the debilitating effects of long COVID. Now that we've already had it and living with it still, or even those who may have recovered having had it for a few months, is our immune system sufficiently compromised, either because in the first place we turned out to be vulnerable and susceptible, even more so because we've had several months, some of us, of being weakened? Does that mean that we should be eligible and should be pushing to be prioritized for the vaccine?
Hard to know, isn't it? I mean, the simple answer is that it's kind of more than my job's worth to kind of launch into that debate, simply because the committee who set the priorities have just argued about this, and have sort of evolved their listing for this country, which is actually slightly different to some other countries in terms of the sort of age stratification, and then the healthcare workers, and as you kind of work your way down the list, it gets very contentious, doesn't it? Things like where do school teachers fit on that list and things. So everybody, once you get to the middle of that list, after the most vulnerable, can kind of fight about where they are on the list, and it's a hard fight. So it's sort of more than my job's worth to kind of negotiate where people should be on that list, because people have so many care homes, hospitals, elderly, and there's so many people lobbying for those vaccine doses. Yeah.
In terms of our chances of reinfection, are we more likely, because of A, the fact we lived with long COVID in the first place, and B, have been weakened for many months, are we more likely to be susceptible to catching the virus again?
For me, the answer is just that's a boring answer and not enough data. So I've been quite a keen student of the reinfections, and we've got a paper hopefully about to be accepted and come out on an enormous cohort of healthcare workers who got reinfected, and it's not. None of those had long COVID, so it certainly wasn't skewed towards people who had long COVID. It was skewed to people who had really antibody responses in their acute attack at the bottom end of the spectrum. So it's skewed to people who've been low responders. So, like all our other discussions, not enough data yet.
And those people that did get reinfected, were they able to say if their illness was worse or better, the same than the first illness?
So of the the cases that we've reported and hundreds of others around the world, I think really hard to say. So I've seen some reports that they were milder, some that they were about the same. Our report was that they were more severe, and one who'd had quite a mild infection first time round and died the second time round. So again, I think sort of jury's out, and I guess we don't even know really how common reinfection is. This is a real kind of glass half empty, glass half full debate, because the numbers accruing around the world are becoming high-ish, and yet of all the people on planet Earth who've so far been infected with this virus, it's a very low number. It's way beyond 0.1%, way below 0.1%. So in absolute terms, it's a fear, but it's not a common thing.
It's something that we do see in the long COVID support group. There are a lot of people coming on saying, right, I've tested positive again, and they do report, and some of them say it's not as bad, some of them say it's worse, some of them can't tell the difference because they've still got symptoms from long COVID. So
it's really important to collect all that data. Yeah, really important.
Yeah. Well, that's something that we can and probably should be doing. To do that.
I'd love to see that data. I think it's really, really important.
I mean, at the moment, it's not even data. It's just these are just discussions that happen. We've got a topic tab called Reinfection where we tag the posts, but there. I mean, if anyone wanted to do a bit of a survey, there's all these people here who, and it's every week. There's a couple of people.
Yeah, I think it's hard, isn't it? Because medical journal editors can get a bit snooty about it and say, well, you can't prove it to me unless you know the PCR test the first time around and the sequence of the virus the first time around, the PCR test the second time around and the different sequence the second time around. And I guess most of your members and most people I meet haven't got that data because we weren't that lucky. No. And yet, people aren't stupid, and they know if they had it, 6 months ago, they stopped having the acute illness, and then they got the same thing again 6 months later. People really aren't stupid.
And the other thing is, if it's not if it's not a reinfection, then it's viral persistence, and surely that is equally interesting to the scientific community.
Exactly. We can't just kind of ignore it because we haven't got a good word for it. It might be more than one thing.
Yeah, and there was somebody in one of the groups who'd said that she happens to know somebody who was able to get genomics done on her original and her reinfection, and they're different. They were different.
There's a dynamite, those examples. They're brilliant.
Yeah, and I did ask her if they were going to publish, and she didn't think so. But I kind of said to her, like,
well, they should, because people are so disbelieving, so they should.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you have questions that you want us to ask in our group, Danny, and others, then
I'll think about it, because it's something I'm very keen on.
We've got 33,000 members and growing all the time, and we want to help. We're desperate for answers.
I know.
I'm conscious of time, but one was final for my question, unless Margaret had any other, is somebody shared a link to a paper which I was too brain fogged to actually read, so I'm not going to pretend I have, but it talked about the potential of using antivirals not only as a prevention of long COVID, but potentially as a way of treating long COVID. And I think ivermectin is a term that gets mentioned in our group a lot, for example. Is that anything you know about, or is that a question more for virologists?
So I don't know about it, and it's more for the virologists. But I'm really interested in the idea because we're all hunting around at the moment, trying to get some underpinning mechanism, aren't we? And if one of the things that's out there that's really plausible is a kind of reservoir of persistent virus, that's exactly what you do to hammer it on the head, isn't it? So I really like the idea as being really plausible, and I'd like to look into it some more.
Can I ask a quick question about vaccine escape and different strains and
Oh
the
God, yeah.
fear amongst people that because there is well, not a new strain but a new variant that we all talk about now, and a possibility that it would escape the vaccine?
Yeah, so lots of strong opinions out there. So my strong opinion, for all it's worth, and we've just submitted a paper on this, is that if you look at the variants that are being most talked about, especially the one in the UK, the B1.1.7 variant, there are 17 coding amino acid changes. Most of them aren't in bits that the immune response cares about. A few of them are, but that's actually a very small number. So we're trying to do the experiments at the moment, but in my mind, when I think about the protective response against SARS-CoV-2, it's lots of neutralizing antibodies binding on spike at lots of different places. And so if one of those places is compromised by the mutation, for me, that wouldn't spoil the vaccine at all. So I'd be really, really surprised if the effectiveness of the vaccines was compromised by these mutations. Really surprised. But we need to do the experiments to see, like everybody else does.
People get confused, I think, with the way that flu mutates and becomes different and escapes the vaccine, and we keep having to come up with new ones. But SARS-CoV-2, as I understand it, it's not like that. It's still SARS-CoV-2 that we're dealing with, and the mutations and changes that have happened to it since it emerged have not made it a different virus.
Yeah, so I do accept that. I think the discussion has become more confusing since mid-December, when we started talking about these new the new variant out of the southeast of England. So up till now, I thought that we were kind of unnecessarily confusing ourselves by talking about flu, because the large family of flu viruses have all kinds of tricks up their sleeve for changing very drastically from year to year, which is why we've always known that we need to have this year's flu vaccine and revaccinate every year. And I'd kind of sort of really poo-pooed that analogy and said, that's just not relevant to this discussion, because this is quite a sluggish virus that doesn't mutate very much and doesn't change very much. And I strongly suspect that the vaccines that we have now will be good for years to come. And so from everything I just said, I still pretty much believe that. And yet I have come to accept that, if you remember from your kind of, all your sort of Darwinian evolution and selection pressure and things, I do accept that if you fill people full of antibodies against particular parts of spike, very, very occasionally, just by sheer, serendipity, there'll be a variant, SARS-CoV-2, that'll sneak through that's managed to change a residue that evades that response, but it'll be a very, very rare event. And I don't think that'll be a big confounder for us, not in the way that annual flu is. But I think one of the other answers that's often given to this is that it's kind of goes, we don't think it's a big problem, and the biology doesn't lead you to think it's going to be a big problem. But the joy of the vaccine approach is that these are kind of plug and play cassette systems, where if you wanted to change the sequence that goes into the vaccine for next year, you so easily could.
Lots of us in our Facebook group have discovered crazy menstrual symptoms, all sorts of hormonal craziness going on. And is that something that should be looked into?
Yeah, so again, we need to find it out. But to me, that's a kind of window onto the immunology and the relationship between the kind of immunology and the sex hormone endocrinology, which is so familiar to me from things like multiple sclerosis, where some of those flare-ups are completely kind of reproductive cycle associated. So I think that offers us kind of windows of insight to look at hormonal interactions with the immune response and get some really good clues what's going on, because it feels meaningful to me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Danny. I can't thank you enough for all your advocacy and awareness raising and calm voice of reassurance. It's massively appreciated.
Thank you. That's very...
To have you kind of cutting through a lot of the noise is wonderful and will make a big difference.
any place you can wheel me out, I would always try and help, because I live and breathe immunology and love it, and I think I've got it very clear in my head so that I can communicate it. Hopefully, although the people at LBC don't think so. So I would always try and help.
Very much.